Vladimir Putin believed he had devised the ideal strategy for the conflict in Ukraine. At least, he thought he had the ideal approach after his initial effort to capture Ukraine within a week completely failed. All that Russia needed to do was to exhaust Ukraine through overwhelming numbers. Eventually, the defense would falter, allowing Russia to swiftly take control of Ukraine. That was more than 3 years ago. Since then, Russia has achieved minimal territorial advancements, particularly when considering its substantial losses. Currently, Putin is confronted with a war that has extended beyond its expected duration and has become a testament to his failure to fulfill his commitments. Putin's significant shortcomings in the Ukraine conflict are fracturing Russia, and the outlook for his nation appears grim. John Foreman articulates this succinctly in an interview with Times Radio on October 10th. Foreman, who held the position of the UK's defence attaché in Moscow and Kyiv from 2019 to 2022, possesses a deeper understanding of Putin than most individuals outside of Russia, and he has a definitive perspective on Putin's failures in Ukraine. When questioned about the connection between Russia's recent hybrid warfare tactics in Europe and the situation on the Ukrainian front, Foreman responds candidly.
Yes, I think, Russia has experienced a strategic catastrophe by invading Ukraine.
Foreman asserts that Putin's most significant failure is Russia's inability to acquire the territory it ought to have. The year 2025, in particular, has proven to be detrimental for Putin. Regarding Russia, Foreman states,
its entire year's advance has been tiny, and it seems to be winding down now and resetting for 2026.
Foreman is not incorrect. Russia commenced the year by achieving some of its least significant territorial gains throughout the Ukraine conflict. By April, a distinct deceleration was becoming apparent, as reported by Al Jazeera at that time. The report emphasised statistics released by both the UK Ministry of Defence and the Institute for the Study of War, 1SW. While both entities provided slightly varying assessments of Russia's territorial advancements, they ultimately agreed that the progress was sluggish. The Ministry of Defence indicated that Russia had only managed to secure 126 square miles of Ukrainian territory in January. This figure decreased to 76 square miles in February and further declined to 55 square miles in March. The ISW reported slightly more favourable figures for Russia, yet still deemed them unimpressive. According to the ISW, Russia claimed 165 square miles in January, followed by 137 square miles in February and 78 square miles in March. In both instances, a clear downward trajectory is evident. However, Putin had ambitious plans for the summer. He orchestrated a significant summer offensive aimed at establishing a buffer zone in Sumy and ultimately capturing the crucial logistical city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. Putin committed nearly thousands upon thousands of troops to these objectives, only to witness a complete failure of Russia's military to accomplish them. Indeed, Russia did acquire more Ukrainian territory during the summer than in the early winter and spring months. Nevertheless, it did not secure the territory it desired, nor the land necessary for making more substantial advancements in the future. Currently, as Foreman highlights, Russia is experiencing another decline. On October 1st, CNN reported claims from the Deep State Monitoring Group indicating that Russia had only succeeded in capturing 100 square miles of Ukraine during September. This figure reflects a return to the levels observed at the start of 2025, suggesting yet another miscalculation by Putin. Furthermore, Deep State asserts that these statistics reveal the severe difficulties facing Putin's war in Ukraine. Last month, the adversary occupied 44% less territory compared to August, claims Deep State. Throughout the month, the Russians were able to occupy merely 0.04% of the nation's total area, raising the cumulative total to 19.04%. Naturally, Russia is attempting to present this situation in the most favourable light possible. Following the release of the Deep State report, Russia asserted that it had successfully acquired approximately 5,000 square kilometers, equivalent to about 1,930 square miles, of land in Ukraine this year. Even though the number seems inflated, it is hardly remarkable for Russia. According to the Kyiv Post, on October 8th, Russia exceeded the million casualties threshold during the summer, and it has lost 281,000 soldiers and continues to do so in 2025. This is without even mentioning that Ukraine has been actively reclaiming territory since the summer's conclusion. These represent significant failures in anyone's assessment except for Putin's. Moreover, perhaps the most significant failure of Russia's leader is his apparent unwillingness to alter his strategy. Peace is certainly not part of Putin's plans, as Foreman stated to Times Radio.
I think Putin's overall political intent remains the same, to bring Ukraine to heel, and we have the chances of peace have become more remote.
This situation will result in Putin intensifying Russia's hybrid and cyber threats towards Europe, which may prove to be yet another error that ultimately harms Russia instead of benefiting it. This matter will be discussed shortly. Initially, Foreman appears to be quite accurate regarding Putin's unwillingness to embrace peace, which consequently condemns Russia to endure additional months, or potentially years, of a conflict that has already inflicted significant losses upon it. Nearly everyone involved in the Ukraine conflict perceives that Putin does not plan to declare peace. Kaja Kallas of the European Union, EU, expressed this sentiment following Putin's notable meeting with US President Donald Trump in Alaska last August. However, the harsh reality is that Russia has no intention of concluding this war in the near future, Kallas stated on X on August 16th. While delegations were convening, Russia initiated new assaults on Ukraine. Putin persists in prolonging negotiations, hoping to evade accountability. He departed Anchorage without making any promises to cease the violence. The Atlantic Council shares a similarly bleak perspective on Putin's disinterest in peace, highlighting that despite Trump's attempts, Putin has repeatedly sought to delay peace efforts. Records documenting the extensive nature of Russia's drone attacks on Ukraine are being compiled as Putin discusses peace. The publication concludes that Putin has made it abundantly clear that he is not interested in bringing an end to the Ukraine conflict. Even as countless Russian lives are lost, Putin's strategy regarding peace represents yet another significant failure on his part, a matter that will be elaborated upon later in the video. At the core of these demands lies a complete unwillingness to relent from his maximalist expectations, which entail Ukraine surrendering extensive territories to Russia and subsequently rendering itself so vulnerable that it could be invaded again with considerably less resistance. Furthermore, Putin now perceives the military-industrial complex he has established in Russia as the primary engine of his nation's economy, according to the Peace Research Institute Oslo. Consequently, bringing an end to the conflict is fundamentally contrary to the objectives of Russia's leader. Putin has maneuvered Russia into a position from which there is no viable exit. Moreover, there are indications that even individuals within Russia are beginning to regard the war in Ukraine as a futile pursuit. Referring back to the Alaska peace negotiations for a moment, Foreman notes that some within Russia believed that the outcome was more detrimental to the country than previously anticipated. While Foreman minimizes the notion that those discussions were a catastrophe for Putin, he did convey to Times Radio,
I just call it a complete waste of time and effort. Trump trying to Hail Mary a peace deal without any preparation at the last minute was never going to work. That's not the Russian approach. I think the Russian wording now is it's a waste of time. It didn't lead anywhere.
This stands in sharp contrast to the sentiments expressed by Russia's political elite after the Alaska meeting. On August 16th, Reuters reported that Russian politicians were celebrating the Alaska meeting as a significant victory for Russia, bringing the nation closer to realizing its desired version of peace. Among those expressing this sentiment was Andrei Klishus, identified by the outlet as the senior lawmaker of the United Russia Party led by Putin. Clesius remarked, "The meeting in Alaska reaffirmed Russia's commitment to a long-lasting and equitable peace." Konstantin Kosachev, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the upper house of the Kremlin, also expressed satisfaction. He stated, "The mere occurrence of the meeting in Alaska, along with its tone and results, signifies a considerable and collaborative success for both presidents, each of whom made a substantial personal contribution towards achieving the most favourable outcome at this juncture." What has changed since August? It is conceivable that such remarks were merely instances of Russian politicians attempting to ingratiate themselves with their leader. Nevertheless, Putin frequently employs those who support him as spokespersons, suggesting that these statements were likely aimed at Trump. Putin seeks to persuade Trump that he has performed admirably and is steering the conflict closer to a peace agreement, all while Russia continues its bombardment of Ukraine as it has consistently done. Putin believed he had Trump figured out. He did not. This represents yet another strategic miscalculation on Putin's part, resulting in significant harm to Russia, and may explain why the perception of this as a waste of time is becoming increasingly common, according to Foreman's assertions. Consequently, Putin is compelled to explore alternative strategies to divert attention from his numerous failures in Ukraine, which brings us back to the earlier point regarding Russia's cyber and hybrid warfare operations against Europe in recent months. The Atlantic Council details several of these assaults in an article dated October 9th, where it characterises Putin as a geopolitical gangster attempting to instill fear in Europe. At the start of September, a surge of Russian drones invaded Polish airspace. Shortly thereafter, Russian fighter jets breached Estonian airspace. Additionally, there have been reports of Russian drones spotted in nations such as Germany, Denmark, Norway, and the Netherlands, all of which are EU and NATO members that demonstrate significant support for Ukraine. These incidents exemplify the types of attacks Foreman references, and they seem to have become integral to Putin's strategy in the Ukraine conflict. The Russian leader is attempting to employ hybrid warfare to deter Ukraine's allies from providing assistance. Furthermore, as Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky remarked on October 12th, Putin is also endeavouring to divert Western attention from the Ukraine war. Russia is now taking advantage of the moment, the fact that the Middle East and domestic issues in every country are getting maximum attention, Zelensky stated on X. He is correct. Foreman also shared with Times Radio what Russia's future intentions for Europe are likely to entail.
I do see, the ramping up of these threats, whether it's cyber, whether it's espionage, whether it's sabotage, whether it's incursions, whether it's at sea or not. The evidence is out. Is part of that to ultimately to stop us supporting Ukraine.
Herein lies what could potentially become yet another strategic failure for Putin. His objective is to instill such a sense of caution in Ukraine's European allies regarding Russia that they cease their support for Ukraine. By keeping their attention directed inward, he hopes to weaken Ukraine. However, Putin has inadvertently strengthened the collective determination of NATO's European members. They are now contemplating military responses to the threats posed by Russia's hybrid warfare, as highlighted in a video earlier this October. Moreover, beyond uniting NATO and the EU against him, Putin is inadvertently achieving the very outcome he seeks to avoid, with his cyber and hybrid attacks, diverting attention from the war in Ukraine. By splitting his military focus between Ukraine and Europe, Putin is neglecting to address the numerous strategic errors he has committed throughout the conflict. It is possible that Putin is so self-absorbed that he perceives no errors in his actions. Alternatively, he may be surrounded by sycophants who prevent him from realizing that Russia's territorial acquisitions are far less significant than he portrays them to be. Regardless of the situation, the emphasis on Europe could represent Putin's gravest miscalculation. Ukraine poses a far more critical challenge for Russia, and Putin appears unable to adapt his strategy in the Ukraine conflict, which has been gradually undermining Russia for over 3 years. This situation ultimately contributes to the disintegration of Russia itself. This situation is unfolding, regardless of whether Putin acknowledges it, and it begins with Russia's geopolitical standing. Due to Putin's actions following the Alaska incident, the appeasement towards Trump that Russia believed would maintain at least a partial alignment with the US is now proving ineffective. Any backing Russia received from the US since Trump assumed the presidency has dissipated, and Trump is now openly discussing providing more assistance to Ukraine than at any previous time during his administration. Trump has expressed his belief that Ukraine possesses the capability to reclaim the territory it has lost to Russia, marking a significant shift from his previous claims that Ukraine had no leverage. The Lowy Institute even suggests that Trump may be correct, highlighting that Russia is suffering significant troop losses on the battlefield and is also contending with Ukrainian attacks on energy infrastructure that are adversely affecting the country's economy. The Associated Press further reports that Trump now asserts he is contemplating the dispatch of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. These missiles have a range of approximately 1,500 miles, which would place all significant areas of Russia within Ukraine's reach, assuming Trump follows through with this plan. This, of course, is a considerable assumption. Trump may merely be speaking to illustrate to Putin the potential consequences if Russia's leader does not cooperate. However, even if this is the case, the shift in US rhetoric serves as a striking demonstration of how profoundly Putin has mismanaged his strategy against the US in a contest he believed he was winning. The issue of Ukraine's strikes on energy infrastructure was mentioned earlier. These strikes have been extensive. On October 5th, The Economist reported that Ukraine had targeted approximately half of Russia's major oil refineries during August and September alone, indicating that as much as 40% of Russia's refining capacity has been rendered inoperative. Gasoline exports have decreased, as have diesel exports. Furthermore, in numerous Russian regions, gasoline shortages are leading to long lines at fuel stations, and limitations on the quantity of gasoline a customer is permitted to purchase. The refinery attacks may potentially be executed with assistance from the US, which serves as yet another challenge to Putin's perception that he had manipulated Trump effortlessly. On October 12th, Reuters reported that the Financial Times asserts the US has been supplying Ukraine with intelligence that facilitates Ukraine's long-range strikes to accurately target effective locations. The veracity of this information remains uncertain, yet it is undeniable that Ukraine has achieved significant success with these strikes. Ukraine frequently hits its targets, possibly due to the US now extending its support. Such attacks may still fall short of compelling Putin to abandon his unsuccessful strategy regarding the Ukraine conflict. When questioned about whether he believes the strikes will result in economic difficulties for Russia, Foreman notes that Putin can incur additional debt, reduce spending in other areas, and continue to rely on Russia's national reserves. He further mentions that countries like China and India purchasing Russian oil, along with North Korea providing Russia with weaponry, all work to Putin's advantage. However, despite these considerations, Foreman still states to Times Radio,
"There's no doubt that Russia is under severe economic difficulties. But I don't think that Ukrainian drone strikes are going to bring about a collapse of the Russian economy on their own."
However, as Foreman himself points out, these strikes, along with coordinated international efforts, could lead to the collapse of Russia's economy. Additionally, there are indications that some members of the EU are prepared to take measures that would significantly impact Russia, unfreezing Russia's assets that are currently frozen, allowing Ukraine to utilize them. This approach would undoubtedly benefit Ukraine, which is facing its own economic challenges. Nevertheless, it would also eliminate yet another economic support for Russia, while simultaneously highlighting how Putin's failures in the war against Ukraine have shifted the geopolitical landscape unfavorably for his nation. A discussion is still ongoing within the EU regarding the utilization of these frozen Russian funds. According to the Straits Times, EU leaders are considering the option of using these assets to provide a loan of 140 billion euros, or approximately $150 billion, to Ukraine. However, such a measure can only be implemented if the various leaders of the EU come together to reach a consensus, as unity serves as a counter to Putin's attempts to divert the focus of Europe's nations towards their own interests rather than those of Ukraine. Nonetheless, there may be another significant issue that poses a greater threat to Russia than any other: the reality that Putin, at 73 years of age, is not immortal. In practical terms, the leader of Russia may have only a few years left to fulfill his ambitions. Yet, should Putin pass away, there appears to be no suitable successor to fill the role of the cult of personality figure, as Foreman refers to Putin, who could take his place. Foreman is quick to note that any substantial reconciliation between Russia and the West, which includes Ukraine, is likely to be a generational process. However, he also asserts that regarding Putin,
his prospect is to remain in power and then die and then leave it to his successor. I think the problem is that every day he remains in office, the chances of bloodshed when he finally dies and his successor comes along increases.
Foreman suggests that Putin's successor may not be as obsessed with Ukraine, and an internal power struggle within Russia could prove to be as detrimental as any actions taken by the West or Ukraine against Russia. This might represent Putin's most significant failure. His apparent lack of foresight regarding the future poses a substantial challenge for Russia. It appears that Putin has acknowledged this situation, and as reported by the Kyiv Independent in May, he has compiled a list of potential successors. However, the term potential is crucial here. There is no clear individual that Putin is preparing to take over, which is propelling Russia towards a future crisis. In September, Reuters highlighted peculiar remarks made by Putin to China's President Xi Jinping. During a military parade in Beijing, Putin allegedly stated through his translator, "Human organs can be continuously transplanted. The longer you live, the younger you become, and you can even achieve immortality." Could Putin's answer to the succession issue simply be to avoid death? While the notion of immortality may occupy Putin's thoughts, it remains a mere fantasy. This type of statement might also serve as Putin's indirect admission of his most significant failure. The leader of Russia has not adequately prepared his nation for the aftermath of his prolonged rule. Organ transplants will not preserve Putin, and the numerous errors he has committed in Ukraine and domestic will ultimately lead to Russia's disintegration. This is, of course, unless Putin's domestic security oversights lead to the country's downfall first. The Russian leader has been allocating an excessive amount of the nation's resources to Ukraine and more recently to Europe, which constitutes another grave mistake on his part. Discover the reasons behind this in our video, and be sure to subscribe to US Warriors for additional content exploring how Putin may be steering Russia towards ruin.